Well, good evening. Think I'm on. Am I on, Jay? Maybe not very loudly. I don't know. If anybody needs a sheet, looks like Craig's got handouts for tonight. Craig, Sandy behind you would like one. Craig? Okay. All right, well, welcome. Good to see everyone here. Welcome to those that are watching online now or those that might check it out later. So this is our Wednesday night adult Bible study and prayer time. We're going to continue in Proverbs. This week we're on Proverbs chapter 7. Is it still not loud enough? Working on it? Okay, we are efforting is what it's supposed to say, right? We're efforting. So, all right, I'll try to talk a little louder. So we are in Proverbs chapter 7, which you can see on your handout. Use your own Bible as well is fine. And we'll just go our usual format. I'll open with prayer. I'll read the chapter, and then we'll just start talking our way through it, asking questions of the text and of each other. So let's pray. Father, we are grateful for the opportunity to be gathered together again here as Anchor Baptist Church. We thank you for the activities of today, whatever it may have been for each and every one of us. Grateful that you have sustained us through to this point to be here with one another. Lord, I ask that this time would be a refreshing time together with one another as we look to your word, that it would be a beneficial time as we look to your word, that we would be taught from it, that we would be encouraged from it, and Lord, that we would become more like your Son, Jesus Christ, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so Proverbs chapter 7. I'll read all the way through, and then we'll get started. So starting in verse 1. My son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. For at the window of my house I have looked out through the lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I've found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon he will come home. With much seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast, till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. And now, O sons, listen to me, and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many a victim she has laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. So Solomon is continuing his theme here in regards to safeguarding sexual purity. We had addressed that in chapter 5 and half of chapter 6, and now he keeps on with this theme here. So the way I see this chapter, there is kind of three main parts. The opening 5 verses, I would just say, is kind of an opening appeal that Solomon is making to his sons. And then at the end, verses 24 to 27 are kind of his closing warning. And then in the middle, verses 6 through 23, is his critical teaching illustrated. Within that middle section, I think we can break that down into 3 parts as well. Verses 6 through 9, or if you wanted to, you could say 6 through 13, would be kind of the approach or the setting of the stage for this illustrated teaching. Then, especially in verse 14, but I would say that second section, just as verse 10 through 20, would be the monologue of the adulterous woman. It's her words, what she is doing to entice. And then the final subpart is verses 21 to 23, which I would just say is the summary and outcome. So 3 main parts: the opening appeal, closing warning, and then the middle part, the critical teaching that is illustrated, broken down into 3 parts. So we'll work our way through those, keep that framework kind of in mind as we go through. So as we usually do, just opening it up, maybe that first section, so verses 1 through 5, initial observations, anything you notice for repeat words, themes we've seen already, or just questions you have of anything stated there in these opening 5 verses. Even if it's something that seems obvious or we've talked through each week, that's okay. Lily, what do you see? Yeah, he does. Yeah, he starts each section directly addressing his sons. Yeah, to you. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Say it again in the microphone.
Okay. So wait, was that you that was talking?
It was Lily.
Lily?
Yeah. Go ahead and say it again. What do you see?
He starts every chapter with "my son."
Yeah, yep. Each chapter he directly addresses again, kind of calling their attention to again. So this is parent or father to children. Yep, so that's the context we're in. Very good observation. Mm-hmm. Jordan.
Getting that workout in. Oh, it's all right.
So in verse 2, where it says, "Keep my commandments and live." So following this instruction then brings life. And then you can see, I know this isn't the first 5, but in 27 it ends that going down to the chambers of death. So kind of like those bookends, maybe. I mean, I don't know, but that kind of stuck out to me.
Yep, absolutely. No, that's a good observation. Yeah, so essentially, we've seen that in the previous chapters, but as Solomon is talking about this subject, very clearly this is a matter of life and death. Yes, listen to these commands and live. Verse 23 as well, if you want to add that in between, this youth does not know that it will cost him his life. And then, clearly stated at the end, this leads to the chamber of death. So great observation, absolutely. Anything else that we see or questions we have of the opening section? Or even if you see connections of things all the way through, that's fine.
Wisdom and the adulterous woman the adulterous woman is, in a sense, personified. It could be a real woman, but it could also be personification of just immorality.
Sure.
But then wisdom is personified as a person or as a woman, and they're contrasted as, you keep this person close to you, you treasure this person, it'll keep you from this other dangerous person. You see the contrast immediately in verses 4 and 5, but I think we'll also see it in chapter 8. Lady Wisdom comes back and talks, and you see it both chapter 7 and 8, 2 different women. But anyways, it's in there 4 and 5. So
yeah, absolutely. We've seen it before. Yeah, this personification and in the female representation. Yeah. Yep. John.
In verse 1, 2, 3, and 5, the word keep shows up.
Yeah.
So it says, "My son, keep my words, keep my commandments, keep my teachings." And then he explains in verse 5 to keep you from the adulterous woman.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. And then other words that would be synonymous with keep, as he says, treasure up and bind and write. And so maybe keep the mic there, Jay. What would those words kind of indicate? If you keep, if you treasure up, if you bind and write, what what does that do if you do those things? Or what does it give, perhaps?
It would indicate that the natural tendency would be to lose them, so either forget them, not think about them,
Yep.
to intentionally put effort into remembering them,
Yep.
because if you don't, then you may go towards the forbidden woman.
Yeah.
So keeping truth in mind to protect against going down the wrong path.
Yeah, you bet. And Jason behind you's got a thought.
So the keep you from, to continue with John's thought, and we've seen this before with wisdom and folly, is that the default position is to pursue folly. Or in this chapter, it seems that the simple person, it's not that he's a foolish man, it just, in verse 7, he's noted as a simple person. His default, if he doesn't have wisdom, is to just wander down this path. And so unless you keep teaching, unless you keep commandments, unless you bind them or write them down and treasure them up, unless you're active against it, you're going to fall down the default, and that's why it's to keep you from. Because if you don't keep these things, you're going to end up just wandering down this path of the forbidden woman.
Yeah. Yep. You bet. And I think also too, then there's the element of almost kind of a time element. If you're keeping, if you're binding, if you're writing them on your heart, we talked about that last week. That has that internalizing, but there's an element of permanence here. You know, again, Solomon's been calling his sons along. Hey, listen, pay attention, whatever. And then we saw a transition where it seemed like maybe, okay, his sons had internalized, had heard some things, had gained a level of wisdom. Now he's wanting them to keep it in a more permanent. That's not just transitory or for a moment or for a season, but there's an element or the idea of permanence, you know, to keep these so much so that they're written on your heart, bound to your fingers, and so on. So, yeah. Other thoughts, observations, or questions of the opening? Got another one, John? Go for it.
In verse 5, it says, from the adulteress with her smooth words. So she's going to make an appeal that is very enticing. It sounds great,
Yeah.
but if you remember the teachings, the commandments, you'll see it for what it actually is.
Yeah. Yep. And we've seen that idea repeated as well in contrasting of, you know, the seeming like honey or seeming like oil, but then bitter, so that, it's not what it's presenting to be. And even then, you know, to look at bracketed words again, like the life and death, just even in these verses, keep my words, but then in verse 1, verse 5, finishes talking about the upcoming presentation of the smooth words, the adulterous woman's words, and then we even see that later on, some repeat of those phrases as well. So, yep. All right, so yeah, can keep making observations there. There's more things I think we could peg on. There's definitely more things that connect to what follows. So feel free if you want, if you've got an observation of the next section, either from the entire second section, 6 through 23, or if you want to just take it a shorter segment at a time. Any observations or questions of the next section? So maybe anybody want to take so let's just look at verse 6. So Solomon says here, for at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice. Why does he kind of start this section with that? What might that mean, or what could we take perhaps as an application even out of that verse? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Kevin does.
I think it's just a real example. He's not using fiction to illustrate what he's trying to say. This really happened. He looked out his window, and this is what he saw, and he describes specifically what he saw. So this really happened to someone, and it can happen to you, kind of thing, rather than, you know, be careful, don't die from skydiving, even though you never go skydiving, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, or like, here's some extreme hypothetical.
Right,
No,
right.
Yeah.
It's reality.
Yeah. Brenna?
One of the other proverbs that my kids hear a lot is that the wise man sees danger and hides himself, but
Okay.
the simple pass on and are punished. And I think it's interesting here, the person observing is distant from it, they're back,
Yeah.
away from it, and
Yep.
they're able, and he says, I saw and I perceive. So here's
Yes.
someone with wisdom going, I know what's going to happen.
Yes.
Like I can
Yep.
see it coming. And the wise man will pull themselves back. They'll say,
Yep.
I'm not going to walk down that street
Yep.
because I know, I mean, this is obviously, people knew whose house this was. He knew
Hmm. Yeah.
this guy was like, oh, and some out of nowhere, this lady showed up. It was like he went down her street.
Yes.
So there was an ability, if you were a wise person, to avoid, to
Yeah.
know what was going on there and avoid it, as the other proverb says. The wise man foresees danger and hides himself. So you have,
Yep.
he even sets himself up as, I am behind, I'm inside my house watching this go on, and I'm like, oh man, I can see what's about to happen,
Yes.
and I'm going to stay back here and you're going to get punished.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So
And
there's
it's
the
even that same word, simple, the simple pass
Yeah.
on, and it's that
Yep.
simple, the person who's just not thinking ahead, which is the default of children. As I read through all this, I just keep going, man, I as a parent, it is on me to make sure my children aren't simple,
sure.
so that they aren't easily deceived because they just didn't know.
Yeah.
It's my job to give them that wisdom and that information so they aren't that simple person who passes on and gets punished.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so that's what we're seeing here. Both this is a real example, but also it highlights the awareness, the observation, the anticipation of the one who has wisdom, has experience, has insight into these matters. April?
I guess I kind of want to follow on that because I'm a little confused about that too, because I noticed that same thing that he knows where she's at. He says he goes near her corner and he takes the road to her house, and then in the whole next section it's like her feet do not stay at home. Now she's in the street, now she's in the market, she's laying in wait at every corner, she's stalking this guy.
Yeah.
Which is it? Like, I don't know. I'm just kind of, I guess it's more of a question. Like, how do we supposed to, does anyone have a question to help me understand that? I don't know. Or answer, I mean.
Yeah. Anybody else have a thought about that? Kevin does?
Going to the market would be advertising what you have available later, if that makes sense. You're loud, you're away from your house where you should be, especially in this culture. That's where your efforts are to be. And instead, you're there loudly letting everyone know that you are available. And then he goes and answers the advertisement, so to speak, in the evening. He knows where to go.
Yep.
So yeah, so that would be what that's about there.
Yeah, or it could be just presenting two different elements of this. Yeah, is that she may just be at her house, and if you're not cautious of what you're doing and you find yourself there, then she will come and seize you, as we see it say. Or also, yeah, it's not that she only does that, and that's the only way you might find yourself in that scenario. She also may be wandering all these places, in the market, at the street corner, all these places, being loud, drawing the attention, advertising for later. Josh in the back. Back here, Jay. Josh first, sorry.
Well, when I look farther down at verse 9, it makes me think that she's presenting herself in the daytime, all these places, and there's an aspect of trying to sneak with the twilight hour, and in the evening, the cloak of night,
Sure.
trying to get what was presented without anybody knowing.
Yes. Yep, you bet. Yep, and that'll be highlighted later. Good observation. Yep, you bet. Jason, do you still have something?
I think to further what Kevin said, it seems that verses 11 and 12 aren't a description of what she's doing, but of her character. So like right now in the evening, she's not necessarily in the market
Yep.
broadcasting herself, because the story we have is a man in the evening going to her house. In verses 11 and 12, this is the type of person she is. She's loud, wayward, her feet don't stay at home. She always, at one time she's in the street, then she's in the market, every corner, so she's here, she's there. So that was just an observation. It seems like 11 and 12 are just descriptions of what kind of person she is and what she does, but not necessarily part of facts of this now narrative.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is I'm surprised by how forward she is and how bold she is throughout this whole story. It does make me think of how pushed sexual immorality is in our culture. It reminds me of that.
Yeah.
But then also something, I don't know if this was influencing Solomon's writing as he was taking something he saw and turning it into a poem or a piece of literature. But it very much reminds me of Potiphar's wife with Joseph. So like I said, I don't know if this is influencing Solomon or not. I would
Sure.
imagine he's familiar with the
Yeah.
account.
Yeah.
But yeah, it very much seems like, the seizing him, the grabbing him, even just the Egyptian linen also triggers my memory.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Yeah.
has anything to do with it or not. But
Yeah.
I just think Egyptian linen,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, Egypt.
There you go.
Because Joseph was in Egypt.
Yep.
But all this, like, she was prepared. She wanted it. She was grabbing him. She was forward. She made plans for when her husband was gone. Everything. So anyways, that was just an observation.
Yep.
It makes me think of Joseph and
Sure.
Potiphar's wife.
Yep.
Going off of what Josh said, I think it's interesting in verse 9 where it's talking about in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. That's a prime time for temptation to happen. So, like, you're out walking by yourself at night, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure there.
Yeah, so we could say kind of, verse 8, verse 9 maybe is kind of the evidence of verse 7. Solomon describes the person as simple, as a youth, as a man lacking sense. Let me prove it to you. I'll describe this. That's the evidence that he is that, in this instance at least, yeah. Kevin, or Jay, you got a comment first? Go. Yeah, go ahead.
So basing off of some of Kevin's insights there about her advertising herself, it's interesting. There's unfortunately a couple of radio stations here in town that do advertise for, let's just call them places of ill repute, okay? And it's, hopefully I'm not jumping too far ahead, but the tactics are basically the same. When, if one were to listen to the commercials, it sounds a whole lot like what Solomon wrote down here. And if you combine that with, the aspect of, let's see here, people who portray themselves in this way there's a level of discretion about it, but it's always veiled in a high degree of innuendo. So it's very prominent and present if people want to listen for it.
Yeah.
Sadly enough, as it is. But so that way, even if the daytime advertisement is open to people who are looking for that later on when it can be done more discreetly.
Yes. Yep. And again, that's brought out later as well, but great observation. Kevin was first.
I'm going to piggyback off of John. We're doing a lot of piggybacking.
Yeah.
Well, you can piggyback off of John too if you want. He can carry us both. Specific principle is he goes to the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, to use, kind of go off of John. And that's specific. I was in the military, in the Army for 4 years, and guys would get their paycheck and disappear 40 miles away to Savannah, Georgia, and come back with absolutely no money. But they were very bold in what they were doing. But if you don't go there, or you don't allow yourself to be in a place where you can be tempted, that solves a lot of problems. And if you stay out of places at the wrong times, it solves a lot of problems. So that's the general principle, is stay away from places that are tempting when it's possible to do so, and at the times they're tempting, right? So, we've had discussions before in my past where you can't avoid a billboard, but you can look the other way. You can't stay off the highway, but you can stay out of places. Things like that. So there's things you can do. Your feet do help you a great deal.
Yes.
By leaving them in a place where they belong.
Yeah.
Time is important, but also I think there is an aspect in which nighttime is very important too. And this comes off of what J.O. said about advertisements, is working an overnight job. I get to see overnight television in the break room. And ads that play overnight are extremely more forward than you would expect.
Oh, wow.
Advertising, you can call certain phone numbers and get conversations that are not appropriate. And it may be a thing of the past for most people. A lot of people didn't realize those still exist, but they do, and there's still ads for them on overnight television. So there's an element even to nighttime which advertisers know
Yeah.
people are susceptible at this time, or, these are, people who take their phones to bed and, spend hours scrolling through Facebook is an extremely dangerous activity
Yeah.
when you have online access by yourself in a bedroom at night.
Yeah.
Just even things like that don't go places, but then even certain times just know, like, this is a bad time to be doing this activity, and usually that's at night.
Yep.
If there are avenues of temptation, if you have a computer or phone and you're using in the daytime, that's fine, but yeah, don't take them places, and don't take them at times when you really shouldn't, have
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Anybody else want? Oh, Jay's going to piggyback
Sorry.
another time.
I mean, there's a unique parallel here. Working in a highly incentivized environment, I know that there are times in which it is beneficial to push certain items, okay? And, I'm not going to belabor people on what is it like being a server, but it's very simple. I want your money, and I want you to spend it with me, okay? It's not to draw a complete, parallel with people, like this woman, but there is definitely a similarity there in really at the end of the day, she's not there for you. She's there for your money. She's there for your power. And not to make people think of servers as just being, money-hungry people, but we know when to push things and we know what times to push them, because at the end of the day, we desire to make a living, and hopefully we're doing it in a, to some extent, an appropriate fashion.
Yeah. Yep. Sure.
Anybody else?
Yeah. Other thoughts on that specific topic? Any more follow-up with that? Oh, Joy, over here, just down the row.
This is probably just real obvious, but I'll say it anyhow. Just because it was something that's been shared with me different times, just in reading through the years, and I can realize my own susceptibility of things. But, at the beginning, he's just very, he's really writing that you need to be very intentional, and you need to have your convictions set. And then when you turn it over here to pay your verse, those middle verses where she's doing all of her persuasion.
Yeah.
Then verse 21, with much seductive speech, she persuades him, she compels him, all at once he follows her. And someone, just wisely said, you don't form your convictions when you're in the midst of temptation, because you won't end up in the right spot.
Yeah.
And so, kind of work at having your thoughts and your armor and and know what it is, so that it's easier to stand against that. And obviously he was very vulnerable to that, but that's not the time when your convictions are probably going to overcome temptation. Oftentimes you need to
Yeah.
know ahead of time.
Yep.
So
Yep.
for whatever
absolutely.
that's worth.
No, that's worth a lot. That's worth a lot. Thank you. Yeah, so with that, I mean, let's explore that a little bit. I had some notes there. So verse 21 says, with much seductive speech, she persuades him and then compels. So usually, if you're going to persuade somebody, that kind of seems to necessitate or require an element of time. And even we see, 7 verses of her speech, that takes a little bit of time. And so, you have to kind of give audience to this woman to listen to what she has to say. So, like, not having that conviction settled ahead of time so that you could recognize this and, I need to flee, like my father said. But you linger, you listen, you are persuaded, you'll put up with much speech, and so then this speaks to, as we've kind of alluded to a heart that's prepared. Either a heart that's prepared to be persuaded, either by intention, because that's really what you wanted, or by neglect, because you weren't keeping the words of your father to be ready for that situation. So it takes a heart prepared previously, that then when you're in that moment, you can be persuaded. And then it almost seems to be an opposite. You go to verse 22, so we're saying 21 kind of indicates that there's an element of time and duration, but then it says all at once, or like the stag is caught fast. It's actually, you could even translate that as the stag is running hastily, it gets caught in a snare. So all at once, as the stag is running hastily, and as the bird rushes to the snare. So it's like, well, if it's time, how does it happen all at once? Well, because the first part is kind of that internal, the slow fade that happens toward choosing sin is an internal thing. It takes place over time. And then the external, when you actually choose the sin and go into that, it seems like it just happened all at once. And then usually that's the story you'll hear afterwards, perhaps when, it's found out. Well, it's like, oh, it just happened so fast. Well, no, it didn't. It was a slow fade internally, the appearance of it. But if you're going to allow yourself to believe that story, you're very self-deceived at that point. So yeah, great observation, Joy. Great observation. Any other thoughts, Brenham? Oh, sorry, John already had the mic. Sorry.
I find it interesting in verse 14. She starts off her appeal. She says, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows.
Okay.
So she's making an appeal that she's a moral person or something.
Or something.
Before, and then just one other thing. She uses the word you several times, kind of making it personal. I specifically sought out you, not just someone, you specifically, which is a lie. But
Absolutely good. Yeah, I was just saying, do you think that's true? All right. Well, let's do a quick follow-up. So verse 14, so she says, I had to offer sacrifices today, I had to pay my vows. Seems like a weird verse, not really sure what that means. So essentially John nailed part of it. There's kind of this facade or this veneer of religion that somehow what I'm calling you to relates to religion, spirituality, it's godly, something. Somehow just putting that facade on it, But if you were to look like back in Leviticus, especially like you could look to Leviticus 7:16, if you were bringing sacrifices or offerings that pertained to taking a vow, you essentially had to kind of prepare almost a full meal, and then you took it back home, and it had to be consumed by the end of that day. There was not to be anything of that left over. So essentially it's part of the enticement, like, hey, I made vows today with sacrifices, so I've got this grand meal that's ready to be eaten. So come in for a great meal. And then she continues on, like I said, and personalizes in verse 15. And so after I did that and I had this meal and I needed to share it, I came and sought you, and here you are. So flattery, building up their ego, and those sorts of things. So good observation. Brenna?
The kids and I have been listening to The Last Battle in the Chronicles of Narnia, and the whole, if you're not familiar with it, the whole thing is a deception, and a certain set of characters is trying to pretend to be the Aslan, the Christ figure, and deceiving all kinds of people. But there's the one main deceiver, and then there's this simple donkey who has these objections like, well, I don't think we should do this. But then the ape, who is deceiving him, just comes up with these persuasions and these manipulations. So totally different kind of sin. But yesterday while we were listening, kids say, oh, man, I kind of feel bad for the donkey. Like, he's getting tricked. It's this other guy's fault. And we stopped listening, actually, at a long discussion. I said, do you think that Jesus would accept that as an excuse? Or do you think Jesus says, and here you have evidence that God expects us to be prepared, to not be manipulated. And we had a long conversation about being weak-willed, that there is no sympathy for someone who is weak-willed, who's not prepared in advance to say, no, this is wrong, I won't do it. So it can even be, like you said, that, well, I don't know how it happened, just all of a sudden this happened. That is never an acceptable excuse, because you are held accountable. You should have seen it coming. You can't just say, oh, they tricked me, they offered me food and it seemed so nice, and you don't see a pass for, oh, I got tricked. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a place. That's kind of what they're saying. Oh, I hope in the end when Aslan comes, he sees that he was just tricked. I'm like, I think that's actually part of the point here, is that there is no excuse of I was deceived, because the character even gives information that he has, knowing he should say no. But then allows himself to be manipulated. And even in this case, because he seems like he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want conflict. So you can see where this kid might have gotten too far in and gone, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but it would be so awkward right now to say, I need to go, or she keeps convincing me. I feel weird saying, go away, and we can see how easily that can happen. Whereas, oh, I'm in this far.
Yep.
How hard would it be for me now to go, oops, I know better, you know, but there is no pass for that. The
Yep.
first part of the proverb says it's your responsibility. And I
Yep.
even think if this young man were devoted to studying the scriptures and things like that, would he have time, you know, for all of these escapades? Because this obviously was an investment of time.
Yeah.
If he was there, listened to her long enough to talk,
Yep.
and didn't say, hey, I got to go to Bible study or whatever, you know, he's obviously, you know, and you think about it, they say idle hands are the devil's playground, you know, that
Yeah,
kind of thing,
yep.
that you wonder part of his simpleness is he wasn't devoted
Yep.
to it. So he had all this time, like, all right, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because he wasn't disciplined and focused.
Yep. Yeah, and it could play into what some of what we looked at last week, you know, about, you know, sleeping when the time for sleep, working for the time for work. Well, he's wandering down streets aimlessly when it's twilight, when it's evening, when it's night, when it's dark. What are you doing just taking leisurely walks at this time that you accidentally maybe end up on this street?
I mean, this was a society before evening lighting and
Yes,
stuff.
yes.
You know, like you went to bed.
Yeah,
You go to
Yep.
bed at dark, you wake up at light.
absolutely.
So you should have been in bed.
Yep.
You should have been at home.
Yep. Kevin?
One thing I want to point out that is very evident in the passage, she kind of advertises during the day. She gets in people's minds. And later on, it's her smooth words and all of the talk. But there's one thing that shows up in verse 10 that's also the way she dresses.
Yep.
I'm almost 60 years old, and a lot has changed in Christian circles. And we have run away from that idea of an idea of modesty, because modesty is not something that anyone will dare to define for fear of being called legalistic or
Sure.
something.
Yeah.
And my wife and I have had lots of conversations about this, because the Bible doesn't give you all the details, right? It doesn't give you a dress pattern or a
Yeah.
pantsuit pattern or whatever, but it does say that you can dress as a prostitute. So there's a way to dress that draws attention to you in a sensual way that is the opposite of, say, like 1 Timothy, where it tells you that you get what draws attention to you is your righteous actions as a woman.
Yeah.
You know, so there's that. So I'm not going to make a list,
Yeah.
but I am a man, and I could make my own list, right? But I'm saying it does matter what you wear at some level. You can blame it on the men, because it is a man's response that
Sure.
he's still responsible for.
Yeah.
But it still says that she wears clothes that are also visually enticing to draw attention to her body, not to her character,
Yep.
or
Absolutely.
maybe the wrong character or something. So I just
Absolutely.
wanted to point that out too. It's not all that's there,
Yep.
but it is an important part of what's there.
Yes.
And if you're a male, you get it.
Yes. Yep. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you.
Well, even to piggy off of Kevin there, there's kind of like a possible inverse of this. This is directed at son and sons, but is it also directed at daughters?
Sure.
Don't
Yeah.
be this woman,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah. You
in a
bet.
very legitimate way, right?
Absolutely.
And another thought that's been kind of rolling around is, Solomon says, I looked, I saw, I perceived. And what struck me is he then narrates this account, this story. This is not voyeurism, right? So much of what we would see in our world, TV shows, advertisements, that's really voyeurism. This is not voyeurism at all.
Yeah.
And another thing connected to that, you would have maybe voyeurism on one side. The corrective to voyeurism is not talking about it, or not talking about it. He has to bring this up with his kids. He has to talk to them.
Yep.
And he lays out the case carefully and discreetly, yet very candidly with them.
Yeah.
So a home that says we're just not going to talk about this stuff is an opposite sort of problem as voyeurism, right?
Yep. Yeah, so with that as kind of a summary thought to that idea would be is that fatherly instruction or parental instruction should both warn of consequences, as he's doing here, but it should also acknowledge susceptibility. Like Kevin's saying, yeah, talk to your boys that you're going to be susceptible if you come across a woman who's dressed this way. Be prepared, know how you will divert eyes, redirect thoughts, not linger, that stuff. Talk to your daughters. Don't be that woman. And then warn of the consequences if either one does not do that. So the parental instruction here would do both things. So, Jay?
Just contributing this from personal experience, it's fascinating to see how many young gals tend to act very simple-minded in this. I get a chance to interact with a lot of people, during the day, and sometimes it's very, very evident that there's just a simple-mindedness in the proper way to dress in public.
Yeah. Yep. Or thinking, well, boys these days don't think like that, or, well, my friends wouldn't think that way if I dressed like this. Well, yeah, no, they would. They're not exempt, right? Yeah.
When you're looking at
But you have that simple-mindedness of thinking somehow my circumstance, my arena is different than what this portrays. No, God's word is accurate and applicable. So, yeah, so we had just a few more minutes. So kind of want to, this is great stuff, man. We're going to have to do a second or third week with all this. But to look at then verse 7, where he describes in 3 different ways this young person. So I've seen among the simple, perceived among the youth, the young man lacking sense. So in Proverbs, especially here, Solomon uses the simple man in, vice versa with fool. So we are talking about a fool here in that way. But we can kind of break that down almost 3 different ways, and then I'll even tack on a 4th. So I'll just say first, this simple person might just be the one who is oblivious, naive, inexperienced, what we might say is just innocent, right? Ultimately, it doesn't mean they're not guilty when they do this, but they're just oblivious. They happen to be taking a late night walk. They didn't know that was the street. They hadn't seen the advertisement of her earlier in the day, but find themselves there. So it could be that category of the simple person. Second, it could be a person who's ignorant and arrogant. So they do know, but they're choosing to ignore what they know, and perhaps they have that arrogance about themselves, like, well, that won't happen to me. I can walk down this street at night, even though I know she's there. That's not going to happen to me. So a second category of person. Or third, it could be the obstinate and reckless person, knowing very purposely what they're doing, and then relate it to last week when we were talking about being caught in hasty words, hasty actions, that same idea of recklessness here. You're going to get caught in that if you're that third category of person here. And then kind of taking it over time, I see here that, the young man who does not learn God's way in these things turns out to be the simple or the foolish old man who forever repeats this folly. That's why Solomon is spending so much time on this topic and will, keep bringing it back, because if you don't get it now, you don't get it early, don't get it young, it's going to trap you forever, and you end up in the chamber of death. It's going to cost you your life. So I wanted to at least pull that out there about that verse. So a couple more minutes, a couple more thoughts. Jason?
So I was going to say option 3, it does really seem like this man knows what he's doing. Like you have, I would think you'd have to be really, really naive to not understand, following a prostitute to her house if she dresses that way. And maybe not, but it seems like he knows what he's doing and he knows what he wants, just like the men Kevin worked with in the military. But at least in my experience with working with people, it's not that they don't understand what they're doing, it's that they don't understand the consequences, which then comes the end of the chapter. So he knew very well what he was going to be doing at the end of dinner when he went to his house. At least I think he did. But he did not know, just like the ox being led to slaughter, he's already tethered. He's already walking to the slaughterhouse. The guy already has a knife in his belt, right, going to kill this ox. The ox just doesn't know it. And so he doesn't understand that this kind of behavior is going to ruin his life. He doesn't understand that this kind of activity is going to lead to death. And it even has the imagery, I think of, I don't know if you've seen the old Arsenic and Old Lace, but the Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. I think of this nice, sweet home with bodies buried in the basement. Just like this, it seems so nice on the outside, but in the end, like, you're gonna end up a dead person in their house, because that's what this house is about killing people and ruining their lives.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so not that I necessarily disagree, but if we just look again back to last week, how we talked about where Solomon says, you know, he makes it such the obvious illustration of, well, can you carry fire next to your clothes and your clothes aren't going to catch on fire, or next to your skin and not be burned? Like, the consequences or the outcome of this action is very, very obvious. So even if you didn't have, you know, a good father or a good set of parents to tell you clearly of these consequences, again, being made in the image of God, you're going to have an awareness that there's probably a severe outcome to this, and you would have to purposely choose to stifle that, to push it down, to ignore it, or whatever, or just be that obstinate and reckless against it. So perhaps it could be that he wasn't aware of consequences, but generally we're aware that there's a consequence, and perhaps a severe consequence, when we're that purposeful, or it takes this long to get to that point of sin. So, Jordan, one last thought, and then we'll transition. Oh, John had one first. We'll get to you.
So, talking about the simple young man, it seems like he didn't have somebody that was imparting these truths to him.
Maybe.
Solomon was telling this to his children, so he was setting them up so that they could follow wisdom, but he's throwing out there, this is what wisdom is, but it's up to them to actually choose to follow wisdom.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Yep, and that's where there's the commands to keep and bind and treasure up and write. Yep.
So the last two comments kind of ended up touching on what I was going to say anyway, but it was kind of that, I mean, having lived as a simple person through some adult years, yeah, sometimes you do recognize that there's consequences, but you are so lost in it that you don't really understand how to get out. It's obvious to those around you who know better, but when you're in it, it's not that obvious. Like, you think, well, it'll just work out somehow, or, you know, everyone goes through this. I mean, it's so blinding to see it. It just, it's so hard. And so I do think it's still our responsibility. Obviously, we are still very much held responsible for the actions and the things that we do, but it's just so tough to get out, especially when you don't have teaching, you don't have, you know, no one's told you otherwise. You've always grown up learning that it's okay to depend on yourself. And I think it's tougher than sometimes we as Christians realize. I think, I mean, it's just the mercy of God that some of us aren't raised in those kind of settings. It's just his mercy on us. So I don't know, knowing different than that, my heart breaks for people in those situations, because I know just how tough it is to know what you're doing. I mean, you're still responsible for it. Like, I don't give a pass on that, but it's really tough. And so I read this as a mother and think, wow, that is the weight of the teaching that I give to my children. Like this, like, it is literally a life and death situation.
Yeah, it absolutely
it's not
is.
like a little mistake or a little mishap. This is seriously life and death.
Yep. And it's each of those little things along the way that matter, like we talked about last week. It's the accumulation of the small things that leads them into the end. So yeah, maybe when you're here, you might be in that complete darkness with a veil over in your mind. You know, you're so self-deceived. But again, it didn't just happen all at once, or that you were always that blinded and self-deceived. There were little choices and little opportunities along the way. That slow fade idea, like I said, you've kind of had opportunities to make choices to go one way or another, and you've slowly gone deeper and deeper in. And then you may hit that point where you are just completely blinded, and then you move from situation to situation where, yeah, at that point perhaps you're just unaware of consequences, or so you've stifled that so much, you've quenched that in your soul so much then that you're not. But again, it's that slow fade. So parents, start early and often with your kids, and show them those opportunities where they made a choice one way or another, and what it can lead to, as Solomon was doing here. So great. Yeah, so much more stuff there. This was great. we will transition then to our time of prayer. So we'll break up into groups of 4, 5, 6, however it works out well. Women together, men together is how we usually do it. Spread out through the whole auditorium here. Remember the 3 main categories. Pray for gospel opportunities that you could have in your week, in your day, in your life, especially in light of Sunday with the encouragement we received on Sunday. So pray for that, share things related to that. Pray for your own spiritual growth from these things, from your other time in God's Word, so both individually and corporately for our spiritual growth, and then continue to pray for our building project and the details there. So go ahead and break up into your prayer groups.